The summer heat in Atlantic City in July of 1957 carried the particular density of ocean humidity combined with boardwalk asphalt that made the entire town feel like it was exhaling something it had been holding since spring. And Frank Sinatra stood on the private balcony of his suite at the Claridge Hotel at 11 in the evening with his jacket off and his tie loosened, looking out at the lights of the boardwalk and the dark ocean beyond them. Having just finished a show that had gone well in the way shows went well when the audience and the band and the room all aligned, without anyone having to work too hard to make the alignment happen. And Frank Sinatra was thinking about nothing in particular, was simply enjoying the rare sensation of an evening with no further obligations. When his road manager knocked on the balcony door and said that there was a young man downstairs who had been waiting outside the stage door for 2 hours, and who had told the hotel staff that he had something important to deliver to Frank Sinatra personally, something he would not hand over to anyone else. And the road manager said the kid seemed harmless, just persistent, and Frank Sinatra, who had learned over the years to distinguish between persistence that indicated trouble and persistence that indicated something worth his attention, said bring him up. The young man's name was Walter Kim. He was 19 years old, the son of Korean immigrants who ran a dry-cleaning business in Atlantic City's Chinatown district, and he arrived at Frank Sinatra's suite carrying a cardboard tube under one arm and wearing the specific nervous formality of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in his head and was now discovering that rehearsal did not fully prepare a person for the reality of standing in Frank Sinatra's hotel suite. And when Frank Sinatra opened the door, Walter said, "Mr. Sinatra, thank you for seeing me. I know this is unusual." And Frank Sinatra said, "You waited 2 hours, that tells me something." And Walter said, "I wanted to give you something. I've been working on it for almost a year." And he opened the cardboard tube and removed a rolled piece of illustration board and unrolled it on the small table in the suite sitting room. And what was revealed was a meticulously detailed pen and ink drawing, nearly 3 feet across, depicting Frank Sinatra mid-performance, captured with a level of technical skill and observational precision that made Frank Sinatra stop and actually look at it, rather than simply glancing at it, the way he glanced at the countless gifts and tributes that people tried to give him at stage doors across the country. Walter Kim had been drawing since he was 7 years old, had no formal art training beyond what his high school offered, had taught himself technique by studying illustrations in magazines and by drawing constantly, filling notebook after notebook with studies of hands and faces, and the particular way light fell across different surfaces. And he had become fixated on Frank Sinatra, not as a fan in the conventional sense, but as a subject. Had seen Frank Sinatra perform 11 times over the past 2 years in various venues along the East Coast that Walter could reach by bus, sitting as close as he could afford and studying the specific quality of Frank Sinatra's stage presence. The way he held a microphone, the particular geometry of his posture when a song built toward its emotional peak. And Walter had spent the past year working on this single drawing, working from memory, and from the dozens of photographs he had collected, trying to capture not just a likeness but something more difficult, the quality of presence itself, the thing that made Frank Sinatra different from other performers who occupied a stage with technical competence, but without whatever it was that Frank Sinatra possessed. And Walter had brought the finished drawing to Atlantic City because he had read that Frank Sinatra would be performing there and had decided that if he was ever going to show this work to anyone, it should be shown to its subject. Frank Sinatra looked at the drawing for a long time, longer than social politeness required, examining the specific choices Walter had made, the way the line work suggested motion without blurring, the way the shading captured something true about how stage light fell across a face mid-performance. And Frank Sinatra had seen a great deal of professional artwork in his career, had been painted and sketched and photographed by people whose names appeared in museums, and he recognized in Walter Kim's drawing a quality that was not about polish, because the drawing had small technical imperfections that a trained illustrator would not have made, but was about something more fundamental, an understanding of his subject that went beyond surface observation into something closer to comprehension. And Frank Sinatra said, "How long have you been drawing me specifically?" And Walter said, 2 years, this is the 4th attempt. The first 3 weren't right." And Frank Sinatra said, "What was wrong with them?" And Walter said, "They looked like you, but they didn't feel like watching you." And Frank Sinatra understood exactly what Walter meant by this distinction, and found himself genuinely interested in a way that surprised him, because Frank Sinatra received tributes constantly and had developed efficient and gracious ways of receiving them without being moved by them. But this drawing and this explanation had moved past that efficient graciousness into something that actually engaged him. What Frank Sinatra learned over the following 20 minutes of conversation was that Walter Kim's parents wanted him to take over the family dry cleaning business. That this expectation was not cruel or unreasonable given the family's circumstances and the practical realities of an immigrant family trying to build security in a country that did not make security easy for them. But that Walter had been quietly pursuing art as something he did in the hours before and after working in his parents' shop, had applied secretly to 2 art schools in New York without telling his parents because he did not know how to tell them and was not sure the schools would accept him anyway, and had received a response from one of them, the Art Students League, indicating interest contingent on a portfolio review. And Walter had not yet decided whether to pursue this, because pursuing it meant having a conversation with his parents that he did not know how to have, and that he feared would end with disappointment on both sides regardless of how it was conducted. Frank Sinatra sat with this information for a moment, and then asked to see the rest of Walter's portfolio. And Walter, who had brought a folder of additional drawings, in case the conversation went well, showed Frank Sinatra a dozen more pieces, studies of hands and faces, and several finished illustrations that demonstrated the same quality the Sinatra drawing had shown, technical development still in progress, but underlying ability that was not in question. And Frank Sinatra looked through all of them with the same careful attention he had given the first piece, and then said, "Your parents are wrong. Not about wanting security for you. That's not wrong, but wrong about what kind of security exists. Because talent like this, properly developed, is its own form of security, maybe a less predictable form than a dry cleaning business, but a real form nonetheless." And Walter said, "How do I make them understand that?" And Frank Sinatra said, "You probably can't make them understand it through argument, but you might be able to show them through results." And then Frank Sinatra did something that he had not planned to do when he agreed to let Walter come up to his suite. He picked up the suite telephone and called down to the hotel desk and asked them to locate a man named Charles Whitford, who Frank Sinatra knew was in Atlantic City that week, because Charles Whitford ran a gallery in New York that specialized in illustration art, and had mentioned to Frank Sinatra at a dinner 3 weeks earlier that he was coming to Atlantic City for a buying trip related to boardwalk caricature artists and folk illustrators. And Frank Sinatra reached Charles Whitford at his own hotel and asked him to come to the Claridge that evening if he had time, said he had something he wanted Charles to look at. Charles Whitford arrived 40 minutes later, a precise man in his 50s with the specific evaluating gaze of someone who had spent decades looking at artwork professionally. And Frank Sinatra introduced Walter Kim and stepped back and let Charles examine the portfolio without commentary. And Charles spent nearly 30 minutes going through the work with the slow, methodical attention of genuine professional assessment, rather than the quick courtesy assessment that might have been expected, given that Frank Sinatra had personally arranged the meeting. And when Charles finished, he asked Walter several technical questions about his process and his training, and then said, in the careful language of someone who did not want to overstate his assessment, but also did not want to understate it, that the work showed genuine promise, that the fundamentals were sound, and the observational ability was unusual for someone without formal training, and that he would be willing to write a letter of recommendation supporting Walter's application to the Art Students League if Walter wanted one. And Walter, who had not expected anything close to this level of professional validation, when he had walked up the boardwalk 2 hours earlier with his cardboard tube, said yes, he would very much like that. And Charles said he would have it ready before he left Atlantic City. Frank Sinatra watched this exchange happen with the satisfaction of someone who had correctly assessed a situation and had used the resources available to him to address it efficiently. And after Charles Whitford left with Walter's contact information and a promise about the letter, Frank Sinatra turned to Walter and said, Now you have something real to bring to your parents. Not just your own conviction, but a professional opinion from someone whose opinion means something in that world. And that might not solve everything, but it gives you something to work with that you didn't have 2 hours ago. And Walter said, I don't know how to thank you. And Frank Sinatra said, you can thank me by actually going, by not letting this turn into a story about an opportunity you almost took. And Walter said he understood. What happened over the following months was that Walter Kim had the conversation with his parents that he had been avoiding, a conversation that did not go as badly as he had feared, partly because Charles Whitford's letter gave the conversation a different shape than it would have had without it, gave Walter's parents something concrete to consider rather than an abstract hope. And while Walter's parents remained worried about the practical uncertainties of an artistic career, they agreed to let him apply to the Art Students League, with the understanding that he would continue helping in the family business while pursuing his studies. A compromise that satisfied no one completely, but that allowed Walter to move forward. And Walter was accepted to the Art Students League in the fall of 1957 and studied there for 3 years while working weekends at his parents' shop. And he went on to a career as an illustrator that included magazine work and book covers, and eventually a position teaching illustration at a school in Philadelphia. And throughout his career, Walter Kim kept the original drawing he had brought to Atlantic City, the fourth attempt at capturing Frank Sinatra's stage presence, hanging in his studio as a reminder of the night when someone had looked at his work seriously enough to do something about it. Walter Kim gave an interview in 1989 to an illustration trade publication in which he described the night in Atlantic City, and the interviewer, somewhat surprised by the story, asked Walter what he thought it was about that drawing that had made Frank Sinatra take the time to help a stranger. And Walter said that he had thought about this question for 30 years and had concluded that it was not really about the drawing's quality, though the drawing's quality had certainly mattered, but about something else, about the specific willingness to spend a year trying to get something right, to make 3 failed attempts before the 4th one succeeded. And Walter believed that Frank Sinatra recognized something of his own working method in that persistence, recognized the same refusal to accept a merely adequate result that Frank Sinatra brought to his own recordings, take after take after take until something true emerged, and that this recognition, this sense of encountering a kindred discipline in an unexpected place, was what had made Frank Sinatra stop and actually look rather than simply receiving a gift graciously and moving on. And Walter said that this was the lesson he tried to pass to his own students decades later, that the world did not reward talent alone, but rewarded talent combined with the specific stubbornness required to keep trying until the work actually said what you needed it to say, and that sometime, rarely but sometimes, the right person was paying attention when you finally got it right. And Atlantic City in the summer of 1957 had been humid and bright with boardwalk lights, and had held, for one evening in one hotel suite, the specific intersection of 2 different kinds of discipline recognizing each other across an unlikely distance.